what is modern in the transitory Indian early stage is a very complex issue. It's not just one being replaced by the other. It's not just one thing that we call tradition and one called modern and one just overtaking the other in series. But how do you negotiate with your past? How do you negotiate with your present? And what is it that you utter that leads on to the future?
Oriental scenery is a series of 144 aquatints, that's a kind of coloured print, that were published in London between 1795 and 1808. And they were based on drawings that were made in India by two artists who were related to each other. They were uncle and nephew, Thomas Daniel and William Daniel, who travelled around India for 7 years between 1786 and 1793. When they arrived in 1786, they spent the first 2 years based in Calcutta. They had actually, in their application to go to India, because in those days you had to apply to the company to travel to India, they described themselves as engravers. They made a series of views of Calcutta. So their first series of views sold extremely well, and that enabled them to raise money to get out into the countryside and to see what India had to offer. So the depiction of India by two British artists 200 years ago has to raise questions now about the connection between art and imperialism. Certainly, as they travelled round, they were perfectly well aware that their compatriots at the same time were busy conquering India. Thomas Daniel himself wrote about this. He thought that art existed on a higher plane, that it had nothing to do with the murky business of commerce or conquest. They were the first foreign artists to go to Delhi. They go, of course, to the oldest surviving monument of the place, the Qutb Minar. This is the earliest known picture of the Qutb Minar. And historically, it's very important because it was based on a drawing that the Daniels made on site in 1789, which was before the British took control of Delhi. And it shows the original cupola on the top of the Minar. This was destroyed in an earthquake in 1803, coincidentally the year in which the British did take control. They went to the Jama Masjid, which by then was a little over 100 years old. It's not really an antiquity at this point, it's still very much in use at this period. And it shows it in a very lively way with this kind of great cavalcade. So they're trying to show the splendours of the Mughal Empire. What's missing, I think, from these images is any evidence of an engagement with contemporary Indian art. They bring to India a ready-made aesthetic, an English aesthetic, the picturesque, and they apply this to whatever they see. One thing you don't get from the Daniels is a sense of the political turbulence of the time. When they went to Delhi in 1789, it was an extremely dangerous place to travel in. They were able to go there only because an East India Company military contingent was travelling that way. Similarly, when they're travelling through Tamil Nadu in the south, the Mysore Wars are still at their height. This is long before the final defeat of Tipu Sultan. You get no sense of the war that's raging in these beautiful, placid landscapes. You'd think that these things would be of topical interest to a British audience. And indeed, the places are of interest. They've heard of them only because of these events. But all violence is somehow left out of the actual image. That's not what a British audience wanted to see. The fact that the prints were originally made for a British audience makes it in a way all the more exciting to display the whole series here in Delhi, primarily now aimed at an Indian audience. And And for some people who may still not know various bits of India, to see what an Englishman or two Englishmen thought it looked like 200 years ago.
In large parts of India, the existing traditions were slowly dissolved and nullified because of the lack of patronage. The British obviously didn't think our art traditions, which were very dissimilar to their own, constituted any major art expression. Now, the Bengal School of Art was a nationalist response to this. So if you remember that the first effort that nationalists made was to appropriate the Western ways of doing things, because they thought that this was the best form of art practice, and therefore to improve ourselves we ought to adopt those practices as it existed in the West.
There was gradually a generation of artists that emerged from these art schools who started setting up practices of their own. Some of these people made what are called the early Bengal oils. Now, some of these were actually educated in the art schools and some were actually bazaar artists. So when we say bazaar artists, we mean artists who are self-trained.
At the center of that were two people. One was Havel. The other person who worked with him was Abanindranath. He was trained in the Western art tradition under European masters, but temperamentally he couldn't relate to that very much. And then the nationalist movement, the first phase of it, which is called the Swadeshi, was playing out itself. It had just begun, in fact, at the end of the 19th century. And he also decided to experiment with new forms of painting, which draws upon the traditional practices. He slightly later also tried to incorporate aspects of Japanese art.
Bengal was central to the emergence of new languages in art with the rise of Swadeshi. And a lot of this resurgence that took place within the precincts of the Drishyakala Tagore house in North Calcutta. In that Drishyakala house, there was something called the Vichitra Club. And the Vichitra Club was actually set up by Rabindranath Tagore, by Abanindranath, by Gaganendranath Tagore. And they would meet in what was called the Dokkiner Baranda, or the South Veranda, in the Tagore house to have what is the quintessential Bengali adda. And this adda was actually about a renewed interest in many of the things that had been forgotten over centuries of colonization. So these soirees used to take place in the evening, but in the day the Vichitra Club used to function as a studio, and it came to be known as the Vichitra Studio. And it was here that the new languages in art, the new ways of thinking, the new concerns, all of this actually emerged. I mean, it led to the making of a new Indian art in a certain sense.
Of course, the Bengal school had a great success in terms of its acceptance across India. Rabindranath was feeling a little uneasy about what was happening. His critique of the Bengal school was on several counts, trying to build an identity on the basis of past histories. The Bengal school was neglecting contemporary world and contemporary Indian reality. Around 1890s, his father forced him to go to rural Bengal and look after their family estates. He went there reluctantly, But once he reached there, it opened up a new world to him. He became familiar with the immense landscape of Bengal, its beauty, but it also awakened him to the miseries of the peasant. So this experience helped him to evolve as a better and different writer. He thought this is the route that Indian artists should also take. So then he turned to the next generation of painters. Foremost amongst them was Nandalal. And Nandalal, unlike his teacher, Abanindranath, was very responsive to this idea. In 1916, Rabindranath went to Japan, and what he saw in Japan was like an answer to what he wanted to see done in India. He saw that Japanese artists responded to nature in a big way, that they not only responded but they produced large works of art, not those miniature paintings. It was a sense of beauty that touched on the lives of the Japanese on a daily basis. And this was something that he liked and wished to see established in India. He decided to start a new art school in Shantiniketan. And the school was to be different from other art colleges in the sense that it was not to be just a professional art college where skills are taught to young aspirants, but it will be the hub of a whole creative movement in India.
Kala Bhavan came about in 1920-21. Nandalal Bose shifted there as the principal of Kala Bhavan. And that is where the journey of Kala Bhavan and what is seen as the avant-garde in Indian art actually, the story begins from there.
He also encouraged them to work outside the studio. And he began to do murals, these large sculptures. Many of them you can still see around, and you can see it makes this place very different from any other art college, because they are not just in the premises of the art college for the sake of learning, that they were scattered all across the campus. So it was art in the public space.
So how Nandalal changes when he shifts from Calcutta to Shantiniketan. I find one of his paintings very fascinating in this context. I mean, not just one, many in fact. If you look at how he drew and painted the figure of Arjun lying down on the ground, and if you look very carefully at the figure, how it is structured, on the one hand, we say that he shifts from the hothouse culture of Calcutta to actually looking at tribals in and around Shantiniketan. So when he paints an Arjun in Shantiniketan, he's actually looking at the village archer. And the village archer becomes Arjun. So you see the transference between the mythology and the real, it's osmotic and it's bidirectional. It flows from one to the other. The real becomes the mythological is actually seen through the real. So that's where I find Nandalal very significant as an artist to look at from the point of view of why he is so important in the history of Indian art.
So on the one hand, he had Tagore, who was an inspiration. On the other hand, he had Gandhi.
When Gandhi picks up Nandalal and thinks that this is the man who can embody his principle of the true India is in the villages, then there's a certain reason why he thinks so. So that relies much on the transition that Nandalal probably has already had by shifting from Calcutta to Shantiniketan, by actually seeing nature, actually seeing the villages, actually seeing people in and around the true India that Gandhi spoke about.
He was invited to do all the township, design the township, decorate it, and he and his students together produced what is now known as the famous Haripura posters.
We find that the theme is absolutely about nuances and bits and pieces of the village life all around in India. And they show people at work, women at work, men at work. It's all about actively being engaged in the lovely rhythm of life.
Between him and Rabindranath, they developed a new approach to art, which was not based on history. Maybe they would be borrowing or taking elements from traditional arts, not just of India, but the whole of Asia. But at the same time, it was not based on history or mythology or religion so much as nature and the everyday life of people.
The Navratna show is really a unique way to try and understand why these artists are important for us. You know, each one is completely different in style, each one is completely different in the depiction that they bring forward to us, and the scale, size, everything about these artworks is quite stupendous, and I'm really glad that the larger public gets a chance to see these amazing artworks. Govindranath Tagore clearly stands out. His incredible caricature figures, the kind of sketching that he did, the nuance that he captured in his lines is something unprecedented in Indian art. And even today in contemporary artists, I really don't see that level of line, that level of emotion coming through, even a sense of narrative of movement that Govindranath Tagore could capture. From this you move on to the skylines of Kashmir and of the hills of the Himalayas, largely taken by Nicholas Roerich, and you realize that anybody who's been to the hills, it takes you a while to realize the enormity of the scale of the mountains around you and how insignificant we as humans are in the larger scale of things. And this is what Roerich was able to capture in most of his images. His use of very strong colors like a blue or a tangerine yellow. These are just not colors, these are moods, these are scale variations, these are things that exemplify the mountains as they appear to him. And we are quite fortunate that we have 2 or 3 of his paintings which are on display here. Works by the master artist Raja Ravi Verma are on display. He's fairly well known across the subcontinent, largely popular because of the print mechanism that disseminated his images to a very, very large audience. But here you get to see some of his portraits as well, and you see a few of the more important European characters that he painted, especially a child which is on show at the exhibition.
Jamini Roy is from an absolutely urban context. He's trained in the Government College of Art and Craft, and he's trained in the European mode, and how he shifts towards the folk is through the filter of the post-impressionistic language. One of the primary sources for Jamini Roy was the Kalighat painting, and if one places 2 pictures that are very closely similar, you know, Yashoda and Krishna with the cow from the Kalighat painting tradition, beside the transition, it's not a copy, it's a translation, it's a transliteration that he did by Jamini Roy. One sees this point of difference very clearly. The line is a trained line, the line is a mathematically perfect line. It begins at a point, it emerges into a thickness, it ends at a point, which is so precisely calculated that that preciseness sort of stills his picture. It doesn't have the lively throb of the Kalighat any longer. But nevertheless, it has the lovely rhythm of one line responding to the next. So he refines, and refinement and sophistication are at the core of what Jamini Roy did with the folk.
Portrait painters and landscape painters came into India in the late 18th century, and it was quite interesting that they seem to have informed each other's work to a great deal and to a great extent. In many instances, landscapes were introduced into portrait paintings, and you saw them as receding backdrops and backgrounds, which gave a sense of grandeur to the portrait, and this was subtly introduced in most paintings because you sort of got a 3-dimensional view of a 2-dimensional medium, and that was really exciting for the patron when they saw the final image. People from small towns who went to get their portraiture done, they wanted to be depicted as heroic figures. Extra jewelry accoutrements were added to the painted portraits which didn't exist. Turbans were put on when they weren't wearing turbans. So a kind of magnification of the person. So everybody really, at whatever level of society you were, wanted a depiction that was far more glamorous than perhaps your existing life to a great extent. In the mid-19th century, a continuity of image making that happened was the styles that the Western artists had brought into the subcontinent. And this remarkable portrait by Benjamin Hudson, I say remarkable because look at the fantastic colors, look at the academic realism of how brilliantly he's captured in this picture. At the same time, this painting tells you something else. It's a fantastic academic study. I mean, very rarely do you see paintings of this quality now anywhere except in very important museum collections. For me, what's really fascinating about this is that bulk of the frame is taken care of by the fabulous red velvet curtain, which seems to anoint this person as somebody from a upper middle class background, perhaps a royal, perhaps from one of the major zamindari estates of Awadh or Bihar or Bengal, because of the kind of costumes he's wearing. The artist has captured small minute details from his waist belt, which is visible, but also at the same time, despite this enormous level of beauty in the portrait, you can't really read the person. He or she is just to be seen staring at you outright. You can't really read. So it's a brilliant academic portrait. It captures the mood, it captures the times. But around 1857, when the first uprising of India's independence was ongoing, the fact that perhaps it's to mirror complexity where the person was feeling that I'm not sure what I'm doing here right now. Maybe this is the situation that the country is in. And that is something that comes out in this blank stare of this person. In the 19th century, we didn't have too many women being portrayed, either as portraiture in painting or in photography. One exception to the rule was the very westernized Parsi community that lived across the country. Especially in Bombay, you had a very large Parsi community who constantly were getting themselves portrayed by photographic images and in portraiture format. And one of the more remarkable images in this show is of this Parsi matriarch who's seated on a chair. If you see, the artist has positioned her on a slight turn. Her entire figure is moving away. It's looking at you from a sidelong glance, but the entire diagonal of the body is actually taking you, creating a sense of three-dimensionality in a painting which is not something that you would see very often. So it's very skillfully done. And for me, really what is most exciting is that the painter has made no concession to try and make this portrait a pretty one. It's capturing a beauty of the person the way she is. So the fun part begins when photography comes to India. And you start seeing the uses of the photographic camera and its lens in play across different styles of portraiture. You had people who were never seen together. Their photographic images were combined and collapsed into a collage. You could see groups of people coming together. The second way photography was to influence portraiture was very crucially when photographic images were projected onto canvases, and then painters were to fill those canvases in. So you had very good likenesses which were to be emerging in the market.
What is very interesting is because in a certain sense the early Bengal oils border on the popular, even though, because they were paintings, they did not have such a wide reach, but they impacted the cult of popular pictures tremendously. In the mid 1800s, when the art school started up, printmaking was taught in these art schools as an industrial art, because there was a great demand for printmakers to illustrate all the texts that were being published for various reasons by the colonizers in India. So one of the first deviations from just using it purely as an industrial art to support the British Raj in India is the establishment of the art studios. And there's a whole cult of printed pictures that came out of there. And these range from a wide range of things, from portraits to mythological subject matter, to religious subject matter, to social issues, and just, a vast array of things for indigenous consumption. And so this constitutes the whole cult of popular pictures, which is the predecessor of calendar art in India. So you find sort of exact parallels of the early Bengal oils in prints. But the thing is that because these were prints and they were produced for popular consumption, they're produced in large numbers, so they have a much, much wider reach. So these same languages actually now come to the fore as part of the Swadeshi movement. So that is actually the contribution that visual artists made to the rise of Swadeshi. Abanindranath Tagore's Bharat Mata, or for example, the 3 print albums that Gaganendranath Tagore produced in the Vichitra studio. And here the artist is for the first time drawing on the lithographic stone using the graphic possibilities of the medium of printmaking. And printmaking was originally known as graphic art. And Gaganendranath realizes this. He exploits the qualities that are peculiar to printmaking alone and makes this lithographic cartoon album. So this constitutes a significant breakthrough. So these are all actually iconic works that constitute the shaping of a national identity in visual art. Of course, Nandalal Bose is regarded as the father of Indian printmaking. So you will see that there is a radically different language in printmaking that emerges.